The clock on the wall of Ravenswood Manor struck 10, and Duke Alexander Ravenswood felt his chest tighten with every passing second. He stood at the edge of the ballroom, watching hundreds of candles flicker against gold walls, and he knew that in exactly 2 hours, his entire life would change forever. If he did not marry before midnight, he would lose everything his family had built for 3 generations. The estate, the title, the land his grandfather had fought to protect. All of it would pass into the hands of his cousin Edmund, a man who cared more for gambling tables than for the people who depended on this house for their livelihood. Alexander had known about the deadline for weeks. His father's will had been clear and cruel in its wording. Marry before your 30th birthday, or forfeit everything to the nearest male heir. Tonight was that birthday. Tonight was the last night. And yet here he was, surrounded by dozens of eligible women, feeling nothing but a cold, sinking dread. He looked across the room at the young ladies gathered near the refreshment table. Lady Charlotte Bellamy laughed loudly at something her mother whispered in her ear, her eyes darting toward him every few seconds. Miss Grace Whitfield stood stiffly near the musicians, clearly uncomfortable but present because her family had insisted she come. Every woman in this room had been invited for one reason only, because someone believed she might become the next Duchess of Ravenswood. Alexander felt like a prize animal being paraded for inspection, and the feeling made his stomach turn. He had tried, truly tried, to imagine spending his life with any one of them. He had danced with 3 different women already this evening, made polite conversation, complimented their gowns, asked about their families. But every conversation felt hollow, rehearsed, as if both parties were reciting lines from a play neither of them wanted to be in. He needed a wife, yes, but he refused to marry a stranger who saw him only as a title and a fortune. His butler, Simon, appeared at his side, his face carefully composed, but his eyes betraying concern. "Your Grace, the hour grows late. Might I remind you that the solicitor arrives promptly at midnight to confirm the terms of the will?" "I am aware of the time, Simon," Alexander said, his voice tighter than he intended. "Believe me, I have thought of little else. Of course, Your Grace. Forgive me." Simon bowed and stepped back, though he did not go far, watching his employer with the quiet worry of a man who had served this family since Alexander was a boy. Alexander excused himself from a conversation with Lord Pemberton about horse breeding and walked toward the tall windows at the far end of the ballroom, desperate for a moment away from the crowd. The noise of the party pressed against him like a physical weight. Laughter and music and the clink of crystal glasses all blending into a sound he could no longer bear. He needed silence, even for a minute, to think clearly about what he was about to do. As he reached the window, something caught his eye. A pair of slippers, pale blue, peeking out from beneath the heavy velvet curtains that hung from ceiling to floor. He stopped walking and stared at the small gap in the fabric, certain he was imagining things. But no, the slippers moved slightly, shifting, as if their owner had just realized she was no longer alone. Curious despite himself, Alexander stepped closer and gently pulled back the edge of the curtain. Behind it stood a young woman he did not recognize, pressed against the cold glass of the window, as if she hoped it might swallow her whole. She wore a simple gown of pale green, far less elaborate than the gowns of the other guests, and her dark hair was pulled back in a plain but neat style. Her eyes, wide with surprise and embarrassment, met his for a brief moment, before she looked down at the floor. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said quickly, her voice soft but steady. "I did not mean to intrude. I only wished for a moment away from the crowd." Alexander found himself unable to look away from her. There was something different about this woman, something that made the noise of the ballroom fade into the background. Perhaps it was the honesty in her voice, so unlike the practiced charm of the other guests. Perhaps it was simply the strangeness of finding someone hiding at the very moment he himself wished to disappear. "You are not intruding," he said finally. "In truth, I came to this window seeking the very same thing you sought, a moment of quiet." The young woman's cheeks colored slightly, and she gave a small, nervous smile. "Then perhaps we have both failed rather badly at finding it, Your Grace, since neither of us is now alone." Alexander felt the corner of his mouth lift, a genuine smile forming for the first time that entire evening. Perhaps failure was inevitable in a house so full of people. "May I ask your name?" "Eleanor Hartley, Your Grace." She dropped a small, polite curtsy, though the movement seemed awkward in the cramped space behind the curtain. My aunt insisted I attend tonight, though I confess I know almost no one here. Then we share that misfortune as well, Alexander said, though he knew it was not entirely true. He knew every single guest in that ballroom by name and family history. What he lacked was any true connection to them. I am the host of this gathering, and yet I feel as though I know no one here either. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, studying him with a curiosity that surprised him. Most young women in his presence either grew flustered or overly eager, desperate to make an impression. Eleanor did neither. She simply watched him, as though trying to understand what kind of man stood before her. That seems a strange thing for a duke to say about his own ball, she said. Strange, perhaps, but true. Alexander glanced back toward the crowded room, then back at her. Tell me, Miss Hartley, why does a young woman hide behind curtains rather than dance with the many gentlemen surely eager for her attention? Eleanor's smile faded slightly, replaced by something more guarded. I am not the sort of woman gentlemen seek out at balls, Your Grace. My family has little fortune and less standing among society. I came tonight only because my aunt believed it improper to decline an invitation from a duke, however unlikely it was that I would enjoy myself. Her honesty struck him harder than he expected. Every other conversation that night had been filled with careful compliments and careful lies, each guest trying to present the most flattering version of themselves. Eleanor Hartley, hiding behind a curtain in a borrowed gown, had told him the plain truth without hesitation. I find that rather refreshing, Alexander admitted. Most people in that room have told me only what they believe I wish to hear. Perhaps that is the danger of being a duke, Eleanor said, a hint of dry humor returning to her voice. Everyone wishes to please you, and so no one tells you anything real. Alexander laughed, a short, surprised sound that drew a curious glance from a nearby guest through a gap in the curtain. He lowered his voice. You may be the first person tonight to make me laugh honestly, Miss Hartley. I shall try not to let it go to my head, Your Grace. For a moment, they simply stood there, the noise of the party muffled by the heavy curtain around them, and Alexander felt something he had not felt all evening. Ease. He was not thinking about the will, or the clock, or the dozens of women waiting for his attention. He was simply talking to a person who seemed entirely unconcerned with impressing him. Then, as if summoned by his own thoughts, the great clock in the hallway began to chime, marking the half hour. Alexander's stomach dropped. 10:30. Only 90 minutes remained. Eleanor noticed the change in his expression immediately. Is something wrong, Your Grace? Alexander hesitated. He had told no one outside his closest staff about the details of the will, ashamed of the desperate position it placed him in. But something about the quiet space behind the curtain, and something about Eleanor's steady, unjudging gaze, made him want to speak the truth aloud for the first time that night. There is a condition in my father's will, he said slowly. I must marry before midnight tonight, or I forfeit the entire estate to my cousin. Every servant who depends on this house, every tenant who works this land, all of it would fall under his control. And my cousin is not a man known for his kindness, or his responsibility. Eleanor's eyes widened. Tonight, you must find a wife tonight? I have less than 2 hours, Alexander said, the weight of it pressing down on him all over again now that he had said it aloud. And I have danced with a dozen women this evening who see me only as a title to be won, not a man to be known. I confess I do not know how I shall manage it. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and Alexander watched her expression shift through surprise, sympathy, and something else he could not quite name. That is a terrible burden to carry, Your Grace. I am sorry for it. Thank you, he said simply, and then, because the silence between them felt too heavy to bear alone, he asked the question that had been forming in his mind since the moment he pulled back that curtain. Miss Hartley, may I ask something rather bold of you? You may ask, Eleanor said carefully, though a flicker of wariness crossed her face. Alexander took a breath, hardly believing the words forming in his own mind, let alone the ones about to leave his mouth. Are you married, Miss Hartley, or promised to anyone? Eleanor blinked, clearly startled by the question. No, Your Grace. I am neither married nor promised. Something in Alexander's chest loosened, though he could not have said whether it was relief or simple recklessness born of desperation. He knew the question forming next was absurd, perhaps even unfair to ask of a woman he had known for only a few minutes. But the clock was ticking, and honesty, strange as it was, had already passed between them more freely than it had with anyone else that night. "Then I must ask you something else," he said, his voice quieter now, almost unsure of itself. "Something I have no right to ask a woman I have only just met." Eleanor's brow furrowed slightly, curiosity and caution mixing in her expression. "You may ask, Your Grace, though I cannot promise I will answer as you hope." Outside the curtain, the party continued, oblivious to the conversation taking place in the small hidden space by the window. Laughter rang out somewhere near the musicians, and the clink of glasses continued steadily, a reminder that time was still moving forward, second by second, toward the deadline that hung over Alexander like a blade. He looked at Eleanor Hartley, this stranger who had told him more truth in 10 minutes than anyone else had offered in 10 years, and he felt the shape of an impossible idea take root in his mind. It was reckless. It was almost certainly foolish. And yet, standing there with the clock ticking steadily toward midnight, it was the only idea that felt honest at all. "Miss Hartley," he said slowly, "I wonder if you might consider becoming my wife before this night is through." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Eleanor's mouth opened slightly, though no sound came out, and Alexander watched her face carefully, bracing himself for the laughter, or the horror he fully expected to follow such an outrageous request. Behind the curtain, hidden from the eyes of the entire ballroom, the Duke of Ravenswood waited for an answer that would decide the fate of everything he had ever known. Eleanor Hartley stood frozen behind the curtain, certain she had misheard the Duke of Ravenswood. Surely a man of his standing had not just asked her, a woman with no fortune and no name worth mentioning in society, to become his wife. She studied his face for any sign of jest, any twitch of amusement that might reveal this was some cruel joke meant to embarrass her further. But his expression held no mockery at all. Only fear, plain and unguarded. The kind of fear she had never expected to see on the face of a duke. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I do not think you understand what you are asking." "I understand it perfectly," Alexander replied. "I am asking a woman I met not 20 minutes ago to marry me, before the clock strikes midnight, in order to save my family's estate from a man who would ruin everything my father worked to build. I know how it sounds, Miss Hartley. Believe me, I have never in my life imagined asking such a thing of anyone." Eleanor pressed her back against the cold glass of the window, her mind racing through a dozen thoughts at once. She thought of her aunt, who had scraped together every coin to buy the fabric for tonight's gown, hoping against hope that some kind gentleman might notice her niece. She thought of the quiet, uneventful life that awaited her, years of managing a small household with little money and even less excitement, waiting for a proposal that might never come from a man she barely knew and cared for even less. And now, impossibly, a proposal had come from a man she had known only minutes, offered not out of love but out of desperate necessity. "Why me?" she asked finally. "There are dozens of women in that ballroom tonight, all far better suited to becoming a duchess than I am. Women with fortunes, with connections, with the training for such a life. Why would you choose someone hiding behind a curtain?" Alexander considered the question seriously, as though it deserved a thoughtful answer rather than a hurried excuse. "Because every one of those women looked at me tonight and saw a title. You looked at me and saw a man asking a foolish question at a very foolish hour. You have told me more truth in these few minutes than anyone else has told me in years, Miss Hartley. I find that I trust you more than I trust any of them, strange as that may sound." Eleanor's heart pounded against her ribs. She had come to this ball expecting nothing, hoping only to survive the evening without embarrassment, and now she stood at the edge of a decision that would alter the entire course of her life. Marriage to a duke would mean security she had never known, a home far grander than anything her family could offer, and freedom from the quiet desperation that had shadowed her family for years since her father's business had failed. But it would also mean binding herself to a stranger, entering a household built entirely on a lie of convenience rather than affection. "And what happens afterward?" she asked. "If I agree to this, what becomes of me once the estate is secured? Do you expect a true marriage from me, Your Grace? A wife in every sense?" Alexander shook his head firmly. "I would ask nothing of you that you did not wish to give freely. If you agree to this marriage, I will offer you my name and my protection, and in return, I ask only that you remain my wife long enough to satisfy the terms of the will. Beyond that, you would have your own rooms, your own freedom, and no obligation toward me, beyond what courtesy demands between two people sharing a household. I will not pretend this is the marriage either of us dreamed of as children, Miss Hartley, but I promise you honesty, and I promise you safety. Eleanor studied him carefully, searching his face for any hint of deceit, but she found none. There was only the steady, desperate honesty of a man with nowhere else to turn. She thought of her aunt's small, drafty house, of the mounting debts that no one spoke of at dinner, of the quiet fear that had settled over her family since her father's passing. A marriage such as this would solve every practical problem she faced, even if it offered nothing of the romance she had once imagined for herself. "If I agree," she said slowly, testing the words as she spoke them, "I would have conditions of my own, Your Grace." Something shifted in Alexander's expression, a flicker of hope breaking through the fear that had gripped him all evening. "Name them, Miss Hartley, and I shall do everything in my power to honor them." "First," Eleanor said, straightening her shoulders as she found her courage, "I do not wish for a grand public spectacle. Whatever ceremony must take place tonight, let it be small and quiet. I have no desire to become a subject of gossip beyond what is already unavoidable given the circumstances." "Agreed," Alexander said without hesitation. "A private ceremony in the Manor's chapel, witnessed only by the priest and whoever else the law requires." "Second," Eleanor continued, gathering more confidence with each word, "I wish for the freedom to leave this marriage, once the terms of the will are satisfied, should either of us find that we cannot continue as husband and wife. I will not be trapped in a life I cannot bear, Your Grace, not even to save an estate that is not my own." Alexander's jaw tightened slightly, though he nodded. "I would never force you to remain in a marriage that brought you misery, Miss Hartley. You have my word on that, whatever it may be worth to a stranger." "And third," Eleanor said, her voice softening now, "I ask that you treat me with honesty, always, even when the truth is difficult. I have spent my whole life, surrounded by polite lies, meant to spare feelings, or maintain appearances. I would rather know exactly where I stand with you, even if the truth is unkind." Alexander looked at her then, with an expression she could not quite read, something between admiration and quiet sorrow. "That is the easiest condition of all to accept, Miss Hartley, for I find I am rather tired of polite lies myself." Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle over her like a heavy cloak. She thought once more of her aunt, waiting somewhere in the crowded ballroom, likely wondering where her niece had disappeared to. She thought of the life that awaited her if she refused this offer, years of quiet struggle stretching out before her with no end in sight. And she thought of the strange, unexpected honesty she had found behind this curtain, a kind of connection she had not expected to find with anyone tonight, let alone with a duke desperate enough to propose to a stranger. "Very well, Your Grace," she said finally, her voice steady, despite the trembling she felt inside. "I will marry you tonight." Relief washed over Alexander's face so completely that Eleanor almost laughed at the transformation, from a man burdened by fear to a man suddenly given a chance at salvation. "Thank you, Miss Hartley. I promise, you will not regret this decision, whatever else may come of it." "I hope you are right, Your Grace," Eleanor said, though a small, nervous smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "For both our sakes." Alexander stepped back and pulled the curtain fully open, revealing them both to the ballroom beyond. Several guests nearby turned at the sudden movement, their eyes widening as they took in the sight of their host, emerging from behind the curtains with an unfamiliar young woman at his side. Whispers began immediately, spreading through the crowd like sparks catching dry grass, but Alexander paid them no mind. He offered Eleanor his arm, and after a brief hesitation, she took it. "We must move quickly," he said quietly, as they walked toward the edge of the ballroom, away from the curious stares of the guests. "The chapel is not far, and Father Collins is already here for the evening's blessing of the household. If we hurry, we may yet make it before midnight." Simon appeared at their side almost instantly, his expression carefully neutral despite the obvious shock he must have felt at the sudden turn of events. "Your Grace, might I ask what is happening?" "Simon, this is Miss Eleanor Hartley," Alexander said, his voice firm, despite the chaos of the moment. "She has agreed to become my wife tonight. I need you to fetch Father Collins to the chapel immediately, and find 2 witnesses among the staff who can be trusted to remain discreet." Simon's eyes widened only slightly before his years of training took over, smoothing his expression back into practiced calm. "At once, Your Grace." He turned and hurried away through the crowd, leaving Alexander and Eleanor standing together amid a rising tide of whispers and curious glances. Eleanor glanced around at the guests, staring openly now, some with expressions of shock, others with barely concealed amusement or disdain. She felt her cheeks burn under the weight of so many eyes, but she forced herself to stand tall, remembering the promise she had just made behind the curtain. Whatever came next, she would not let fear rule her tonight. "Your Grace," she whispered as they moved through the crowd toward the chapel wing of the manor. "Your guests are staring rather intently." "Let them stare," Alexander said, his voice quiet but resolute. "By tomorrow morning, they will have found some new scandal to discuss. Tonight, I care only about reaching that chapel before the clock finishes its final chime." They passed through a set of tall doors and into a quieter hallway, the noise of the ballroom fading behind them as they hurried toward the manor's private chapel. Eleanor's heart pounded with every step, not from fear alone, but from a strange, unfamiliar excitement she could not fully explain. She had come to this ball expecting a night of quiet misery, hiding from a world that had never quite made room for her. Instead, she now walked arm in arm with a duke toward a wedding that would change the entire shape of her life. As they reached the chapel doors, Eleanor caught sight of her aunt hurrying down the hallway toward them, her face a mixture of confusion and alarm. "Eleanor, what on earth is happening? Someone said you were seen leaving with the Duke himself." "Aunt Margaret," Eleanor said, taking a steadying breath before continuing. "I do not have time to explain everything now, but I am about to be married, tonight, to His Grace, the Duke of Ravenswood." Margaret's mouth fell open, and for a moment she seemed entirely unable to speak. "Married? Tonight? Eleanor, this is madness. You cannot simply marry a man you met an hour ago." "I know how it must sound," Eleanor said gently, taking her aunt's hands in her own. "But I promise you, this is my choice, made with clear eyes. His Grace faces a terrible deadline tonight, and I have chosen to help him, in exchange for a life far more secure than the one that awaits me otherwise. Please, Aunt Margaret, I need your support tonight, of all nights." Margaret searched her niece's face for a long moment, and whatever she found there seemed to ease some of her alarm, though worry remained clear in her eyes. "If this is truly your choice, Eleanor, then I will stand beside you. But you must promise me, you will write to me often, and you must promise me that if this marriage ever brings you harm, you will come to me at once." "I promise," Eleanor said, embracing her aunt tightly, before Alexander gently guided her toward the chapel doors, where Father Collins now stood waiting, his expression a careful mixture of professional composure and genuine surprise at the unusual circumstances of the evening. Inside the small chapel, candles had already been lit along the altar, their flickering light casting long shadows across the stone walls. Two servants stood nearby, having been quickly summoned by Simon to serve as witnesses, their eyes wide with barely suppressed curiosity about the strange ceremony they were about to observe. Eleanor felt her hands trembling slightly as she took her place before the altar beside Alexander, the weight of the moment finally settling fully upon her. Father Collins cleared his throat and opened his prayer book, his voice calm and steady despite the unusual haste of the proceedings. "We are gathered here tonight, somewhat unexpectedly, to join this man and this woman in marriage. Given the circumstances, I shall proceed with the essential vows required by law, though I trust both parties understand the seriousness of what they are about to undertake." Alexander glanced at Eleanor, and in his eyes she saw not the desperate stranger from behind the curtain, but something softer, something almost hopeful. "I understand completely, Father," he said quietly. "As do I," Eleanor added, her voice steadier than she expected. As Father Collins began the ceremony, Eleanor could hear, faintly in the distance, the great clock of the manor, beginning its final chime of the hour, each toll echoing through the halls like the ticking countdown to a fate she had chosen to change with her own two hands. The chapel fell silent except for the soft crackle of candle flames and the distant, steady chime of the great clock, counting down the final minutes before midnight. Father Collins glanced briefly toward the sound, before returning his attention to the two people standing before him, his voice calm, despite the urgency pressing against every corner of the room. "Alexander James Ravenswood," he began, "do you take this woman, Eleanor Hartley, to be your lawful wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" Alexander looked at Eleanor, and for a moment, the fear that had gripped him all evening seemed to soften into something quieter, something almost like relief. "I do," he said, his voice firm and clear despite the strange circumstances surrounding the words. Father Collins turned to Eleanor next, and she felt every eye in the small chapel settle upon her, the two servant witnesses watching with poorly concealed curiosity, her aunt standing near the back with tears already gathering in her eyes, and Alexander himself watching her with an expression she could not entirely read. "Eleanor Hartley," Father Collins continued, "do you take this man, Alexander James Ravenswood, to be your lawful wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" Eleanor thought for just a moment of the life she had expected to lead before tonight, the quiet years of managing her aunt's small household, waiting for a proposal that might never come. She thought of the strange honesty she had found behind the curtain, the fear in Alexander's eyes that had somehow made her trust him more than any polished gentleman she had ever met, and she thought of her own courage, the courage she had found to negotiate her own terms rather than simply accept whatever fate offered her. "I do," she said, and the words felt heavier and lighter all at once, a promise made not out of love, but out of something equally powerful, a shared understanding between two people who had chosen honesty over pretense. Father Collins closed his prayer book with a soft snap. "Then by the authority given to me, and under somewhat unusual but entirely legal circumstances, I now pronounce you husband and wife." At that exact moment, the great clock in the hallway struck its final chime, the deep, resonant sound of midnight rolling through the manor like a wave breaking upon the shore. Alexander closed his eyes briefly, and Eleanor watched the tension that had gripped his shoulders all evening finally begin to ease, replaced by something that looked remarkably like disbelief, mixed with gratitude. "We made it," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. Eleanor allowed herself a small smile, the strangeness of the entire evening finally catching up with her all at once. She had walked into this manor as an anonymous guest, invited only out of obligation, and she was leaving the chapel as the Duchess of Ravenswood. The thought alone was enough to make her head spin. Simon entered the chapel just moments later, his face pale but composed, carrying a folded letter in his hands. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion, but the solicitor has arrived precisely as scheduled. He is waiting in the study to confirm the terms of the will." Alexander nodded, offering Eleanor his arm once more. "Then let us not keep him waiting. Miss Hartley, or rather my wife, would you accompany me?" Eleanor took his arm, still trying to steady the racing thoughts in her mind, and together they walked from the chapel toward the study, followed closely by Simon, Father Collins, and Margaret, who dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief while casting worried glances toward her niece. The solicitor, a thin, serious man, named Mr. Whitcomb, sat waiting behind the large mahogany desk in Alexander's study, a stack of papers arranged neatly before him. He rose as they entered, his eyes moving quickly between Alexander and the unfamiliar young woman at his side. "Your Grace," Whitcomb said, his tone carefully neutral, "I trust you understand the seriousness of tonight's deadline. The terms of your father's will were quite explicit. Might I ask who this young lady is?" "Mr. Whitcomb," Alexander said, standing tall, despite the exhaustion clearly settling into his features, "allow me to introduce my wife, Eleanor Ravenswood, formerly Eleanor Hartley. We were married not 10 minutes ago in the manor's chapel, witnessed by Father Collins and 2 members of my household staff. I trust this satisfies the conditions of my father's will." Whitcomb's eyebrows rose slightly, though decades of practice kept his expression otherwise composed. He turned to Father Collins. "Is this true, Father? You performed this ceremony tonight, before the stroke of midnight?" "It is entirely true," Father Collins confirmed. "I performed the ceremony myself, and the marriage was completed just as the clock finished its final chime. I would swear to this before any court, should it become necessary." Whitcomb studied the documents before him for a long moment, running his finger along several lines of dense legal text, before finally looking up again. "Then it appears, Your Grace, that you have satisfied the terms of your father's will, with mere moments to spare. The estate, the title, and all associated properties shall remain under your control, as originally intended." A quiet exhale of relief passed through the room, and Eleanor felt Alexander's hand tighten briefly around her own, before he seemed to remember himself and let go, clearing his throat. "Thank you, Mr. Whitcomb." I know this has been an unusual evening. Unusual is one word for it, Your Grace, Whitcomb said, though the faintest hint of a smile touched his lips. I shall prepare the necessary documents confirming your continued ownership of the estate, and I will need both your signatures, along with the marriage certificate, for my records. As Whitcomb began arranging papers across the desk, the study door burst open without warning, and a tall, broad-shouldered man strode in, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. Eleanor recognized him immediately from Alexander's description. The sharp features, the expensive but slightly disheveled clothing, the barely concealed contempt in his expression. This could only be Edmund, the cousin who had waited eagerly for this very night to claim an estate that was never truly his. What is the meaning of this? Edmund demanded, his eyes darting between Alexander, Eleanor, and the documents spread across the desk. I heard whispers throughout the ballroom that you had married some unknown woman in secret. Surely this is some trick to delay the inevitable. There is no trick, Edmund, Alexander said, his voice calm despite the obvious tension crackling in the air between the two men. I have married, as required by my father's will, before the stroke of midnight. Mr. Whitcomb has confirmed the marriage satisfies every condition. The estate remains mine. Edmund's face darkened further as he turned toward Whitcomb. Is this true? You would allow some hasty, secret marriage to a woman no one has ever heard of to stand as legitimate fulfillment of the will's requirements? Whitcomb met Edmund's furious gaze with the calm patience of a man who had seen countless family disputes over inheritance. The will states clearly that the Duke must marry before his 30th birthday, with no further specifications regarding the manner or timing of the ceremony beyond that deadline. His Grace has satisfied this condition entirely, witnessed by a priest and 2 additional witnesses, all of whom stand ready to confirm the marriage under oath, if required. Edmund's jaw clenched so tightly that Eleanor could see the muscle twitching beneath his skin. He turned his sharp gaze toward her then, studying her with an expression that made her skin crawl, a mixture of contempt and calculation that suggested he was already searching for some weakness to exploit. "And who exactly are you?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "I do not recognize your family name among any of the respectable houses in this county." Eleanor lifted her chin, refusing to shrink beneath his glare, despite the fear fluttering in her chest. "I am Eleanor Ravenswood, Duchess of Ravenswood, as of tonight. My family, while not among the wealthiest in the county, has always conducted itself with honesty and integrity, qualities I hope to bring to this household as well." Something flickered in Edmund's eyes at her response, surprise perhaps, or perhaps simple annoyance that she had not cowered before his obvious attempt at intimidation. "How very convenient," he said finally, his voice low and sharp, "that a woman of no fortune and no standing should appear at precisely the right moment to save my cousin's inheritance. One might almost suspect this entire marriage was arranged well in advance, a scheme designed to cheat me of what is rightfully mine." "There was no scheme, Edmund," Alexander said firmly, stepping slightly forward as if to place himself between his cousin and his new wife. "I met Eleanor for the first time this very evening, mere hours ago. Our marriage was hastily arranged, yes, out of necessity, but it is entirely legitimate, and it will stand, regardless of what accusations you choose to fling in your disappointment." Edmund's eyes narrowed, and for a long, tense moment, Eleanor feared he might attempt something reckless, some desperate final gambit to salvage his lost claim to the estate. But instead, he simply straightened his coat and stepped back toward the door, his expression settling into something colder and more calculating than open anger. "This is not finished," he said quietly, his voice carrying a warning that sent a chill through the room. "I will find the truth behind this convenient marriage, cousin, and when I do, you may find your precious estate far less secure than you believe it to be tonight." Without waiting for a response, Edmund turned and stormed from the study, slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. Silence settled over the room in his absence, broken only by the soft rustle of Whitcomb gathering his papers back into order. "Forgive my cousin's behavior," Alexander said quietly, turning to Eleanor with obvious concern in his eyes. "He has never been a man to accept defeat gracefully, and I fear tonight has wounded his pride considerably. I do not believe he will simply let this matter rest." Eleanor felt a flicker of unease at Edmund's parting threat, but she pushed it aside for the moment, focusing instead on the strange, exhausting reality of the night she had just lived through. I do not doubt it, Your Grace. But whatever comes next, I imagine we shall face it together, as husband and wife. Alexander looked at her for a long moment, something soft and grateful passing across his features. Together, then. And please, Eleanor, there is no need to call me Your Grace when we are alone. My name is Alexander. Alexander, Eleanor repeated, testing the name aloud for the first time. Very well. And you may call me Eleanor, of course, though I suppose Duchess Ravenswood has rather a nice sound to it as well. A tired but genuine smile crossed Alexander's face, the first true smile Eleanor had seen from him since their strange meeting behind the curtain. It does indeed, Duchess. Now, if you will permit me, I believe we have papers to sign, and a household to inform of tonight's rather unusual developments. As Whitcomb finished arranging the final documents, and Father Collins offered his blessing before departing, Eleanor found herself glancing toward the study window, where the dark night sky stretched endlessly beyond the manor's grounds. Somewhere out there, Edmund was already plotting his next move, and somewhere within these very walls, an entire household of servants and staff waited to learn that their new mistress was a woman none of them had ever met before tonight. Eleanor squared her shoulders, ready to face whatever challenges awaited her as the new Duchess of Ravenswood, though she could not have predicted just how many trials still lay ahead in the days and weeks to come. Morning arrived at Ravenswood Manor with a pale golden light that spilled gently across the gardens, though Eleanor had barely slept at all during the few hours since her strange and sudden wedding. She lay in the unfamiliar softness of a grand bedchamber, staring up at an ornately carved ceiling, trying to convince herself that the events of the previous night had truly happened, and were not simply some vivid, impossible dream. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts, and a young maid entered carrying a tray with tea and warm bread. "Good morning, Your Grace," the maid said, her voice bright but her eyes clearly curious, taking in every detail of the new Duchess with obvious fascination. "I am Grace, one of the household maids. His Grace asked that I see to your needs this morning and help you settle in." "Thank you, Grace," Eleanor said, sitting up slowly and accepting the tea gratefully. "I confess I hardly know where to begin this morning. Everything feels rather strange and new." Grace set down the tray and began moving about the room, opening curtains and arranging fresh linens with practiced efficiency, though she glanced back at Eleanor several times, as if working up the courage to speak. "If I may say so, Your Grace, the whole household has been talking of nothing else since last night. No one expected His Grace to marry so suddenly, and certainly not to someone none of us had ever met before." Eleanor felt a flush of embarrassment creep up her neck, though she forced herself to remain composed. "I imagine it must seem rather strange to everyone here. I promise you, it was equally strange for me as well."
"Well," Grace said, offering a small, kind smile, "strange or not, I think it rather romantic, if you ask me. His Grace has always seemed such a serious, lonely sort of man since his father passed."
"Perhaps some good will come of all this." Eleanor appreciated the kindness in Grace's words, though she could not help but wonder how many other members of the household shared such generous sentiments, and how many instead viewed her arrival with suspicion or resentment. As the new Duchess, she would need to earn the trust and respect of everyone within these walls, a task that felt far more daunting in the daylight than it had seemed during the desperate honesty of the previous night. After dressing in a simple morning gown provided from the manor's stores, Eleanor made her way downstairs, uncertain exactly where she should go, or what duties, if any, awaited her as the new mistress of such a grand household. She found Alexander in the breakfast room, seated at the head of a long table, looking considerably more rested than she felt, though shadows still lingered beneath his eyes. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said, rising slightly as she entered, a gesture of courtesy that surprised her, given how informal their marriage had begun. "I trust you slept well, despite the unusual circumstances of last night." "I confess I slept very little," Eleanor admitted, taking the seat offered to her near his own. "I kept expecting to wake and find the entire evening had been nothing more than a dream." "I understand the feeling entirely," Alexander said, a faint smile touching his lips. "I have been Duke of Ravenswood for 3 years now, and I still find myself surprised each morning that I did not lose everything last night." As breakfast was served, Alexander explained the practical arrangements of the household, introducing Eleanor to the routines and responsibilities that would now fall under her purview as Duchess. She would oversee certain aspects of household management, attend social functions alongside him when required, and gradually become acquainted with the tenants and staff who depended upon the estate for their livelihoods. It was an overwhelming amount of information for a woman who had, only yesterday, expected nothing more from life than quiet obscurity. "I know this is a great deal to absorb all at once," Alexander said, watching her expression carefully. "Please know that I do not expect you to master everything immediately. Mrs. Whitmore, our housekeeper, has managed this household with great skill for many years and will assist you in learning the necessary duties." "Thank you," Eleanor said, grateful for his patience, despite the strange circumstances that had brought them together. "I only wish to do right by this household, and by you, given everything you have offered me." Alexander studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful passing behind his eyes. "You need not feel obligated toward gratitude, Eleanor. This arrangement benefits us both equally. You have saved my family's legacy, and in return, I hope to offer you a life of security and respect, whatever else this marriage may or may not become between us." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Simon, who entered with a carefully composed expression that nonetheless carried an undertone of concern. "Your Grace, forgive the interruption, but a letter has arrived, addressed to both yourself and the new Duchess. It appears to be from your cousin, Mr. Ashford." Alexander's expression darkened slightly as he accepted the sealed letter from Simon's outstretched hand. He broke the seal quickly and read through the contents, his jaw tightening with each passing line. When he finished, he set the letter down on the table with visible restraint. "What does it say?" Eleanor asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer given the events of the previous night. "Edmund claims he intends to contest the legitimacy of our marriage," Alexander said, his voice tight with barely concealed frustration. "He suggests that a marriage conducted with such haste, to a woman entirely unknown to society, raises questions of impropriety that deserve further investigation. He has apparently already begun making inquiries among his acquaintances regarding your family background, Eleanor." Eleanor felt a cold knot form in her stomach at the thought of Edmund digging through her family's modest history, searching for any detail he might twist into scandal or suspicion. What sort of inquiries could he possibly make? "My family has nothing to hide, though we certainly have little to offer in terms of fortune or connections." "That may be precisely his intention," Alexander said grimly. "If he cannot prove the marriage illegitimate outright, he may instead attempt to create enough doubt and scandal around your background that society itself turns against us, making our position untenable regardless of the law's judgment." The weight of this new threat settled heavily over the breakfast table, and Eleanor found her appetite disappearing entirely as she considered the implications. She had expected, perhaps naively, that securing the marriage and satisfying the will's requirements would be the end of their troubles. She had not fully appreciated just how determined Edmund might be to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. "What can we do?" she asked finally, forcing herself to remain calm despite the anxiety building within her. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, considering the question carefully. "For now, I believe our best course is simply to live openly and honestly as husband and wife, presenting a united front to society that leaves little room for doubt or suspicion. We must attend social functions together, demonstrate genuine partnership in managing this household, and give Edmund no evidence to support whatever claims he wishes to make against us." "That seems reasonable enough," Eleanor said, though privately she wondered how convincingly two virtual strangers could present themselves as a genuine married couple to a society already primed for scandal and gossip. Over the following days, Eleanor found herself thrust into a whirlwind of new responsibilities and social obligations. She accompanied Alexander to visit several tenant families on the estate grounds, listening carefully as they discussed matters of crop yields, repairs needed to cottages, and various concerns that fell under the Duke's responsibility to address. She found herself genuinely moved by the earnest gratitude many tenants expressed toward Alexander for his fair and considerate management of their affairs, a stark contrast to the rumors she had heard regarding Edmund's reputation for carelessness and self-interest. In the evenings, Alexander patiently explained the various social customs and expectations Eleanor would need to navigate as Duchess, from the proper etiquette for receiving visitors to the delicate art of managing correspondence with other noble families. Eleanor absorbed this information eagerly, determined to prove herself capable of the role she had so suddenly assumed. even if the marriage itself remained built upon nothing more than practical necessity. Despite the strangeness of their circumstances, Eleanor began to notice small moments of genuine connection forming between herself and Alexander. He possessed a dry sense of humor she had not expected, offering quiet observations during dull social gatherings that made her stifle laughter behind polite smiles. He listened attentively when she spoke, asking thoughtful questions about her opinions, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak, a quality she had rarely encountered among the gentlemen she had known previously. One evening, nearly a week after their wedding, Eleanor found Alexander alone in the manor's extensive library, seated near the fireplace with a book resting unread in his lap, his gaze fixed instead on the dancing flames before him. She hesitated in the doorway, uncertain whether to intrude upon what appeared to be a private moment of contemplation. "You may come in, Eleanor," Alexander said without turning, apparently having noticed her presence despite his distant expression. "I promise I do not bite, whatever rumors Edmund may be spreading about my character these days." Eleanor smiled and entered the library, taking a seat in the chair opposite his own near the fire. "I did not mean to disturb your thoughts. You seemed rather far away just now." Alexander set the unread book aside and studied her for a long moment, something contemplative in his expression. "I was thinking of my father, actually. He built this estate through decades of careful, honest work, determined to leave something meaningful for future generations. I wonder sometimes what he would think of the circumstances surrounding my marriage, whether he would approve of the choice I made that night behind the curtain." "What do you believe he would think?" Eleanor asked gently, sensing the vulnerability behind his usually composed exterior. "I believe," Alexander said slowly, "that he valued honesty and courage above nearly everything else. I think he would have appreciated a woman who spoke plainly to me, rather than one who simply flattered my title. Whatever else this marriage may be, Eleanor, I do not regret the choice I made that night, strange as the circumstances were." Eleanor felt something warm settle in her chest at his words, an unfamiliar sense of belonging that she had not expected to find within these grand but unfamiliar walls. "Nor do I regret my choice, Alexander, though I confess, there are still moments when the strangeness of it all catches me entirely off guard." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the fire crackling softly between them, and Eleanor found herself wondering, not for the first time, whether this marriage born of desperate necessity might yet grow into something far more meaningful than either of them had initially expected. But even as this quiet hope took root within her, she remained acutely aware of Edmund's lingering threat, a shadow hanging over their fragile new beginning that showed no signs of fading away quietly. 2 weeks after the wedding, Eleanor accompanied Alexander to a grand dinner hosted by Lord and Lady Pemberton, one of the first major social events she would attend as the new Duchess of Ravenswood. She had spent considerable time preparing for this evening, practicing the various forms of address and etiquette Alexander had patiently taught her, determined not to embarrass herself or her husband in front of society's most watchful eyes. As their carriage approached the Pemberton estate, Eleanor felt her nerves tightening with each passing mile. "What if they ask questions I cannot answer properly?" she asked, smoothing the fabric of her gown for the third time in as many minutes. "You need only be yourself, Eleanor," Alexander said reassuringly, though she noticed a slight tension in his own posture that suggested he shared some of her anxiety. "The same honesty that drew me to you behind that curtain will serve you well tonight, whatever questions may arise." The Pemberton estate glittered with candlelight as they arrived, and Eleanor took a steadying breath before stepping from the carriage on Alexander's arm. Almost immediately, she felt the weight of curious stares settling upon her from every direction, guests whispering behind gloved hands, as she and Alexander made their way toward the entrance. Inside, Lady Pemberton greeted them with practiced warmth, though her eyes lingered on Eleanor with obvious curiosity.
"Your Grace, and the new Duchess. How wonderful you could join us this evening. I confess, the entire county has spoken of little else these past 2 weeks besides your rather sudden marriage."
"We are grateful for your invitation, Lady Pemberton," Alexander replied smoothly, though Eleanor could sense the careful diplomacy required to navigate such pointed comments. "My wife and I are settling into married life quite happily, despite the unusual circumstances of our beginning." As the evening progressed, Eleanor found herself the subject of endless polite but probing questions from various guests, each seemingly determined to uncover some scandalous detail behind the hasty marriage. She answered each question with careful honesty, just as she had promised Alexander she would, though she quickly realized that honesty alone could not protect her from those determined to find fault regardless of the truth. "Tell me, Duchess," said an older woman Eleanor recognized as Lady Ashworth, one of society's most notorious gossips, "how exactly did you come to meet the Duke? I understand it was rather sudden, at his own ball no less." Eleanor met the woman's sharp gaze steadily, refusing to shrink beneath the obvious scrutiny. "His Grace and I found ourselves in conversation during the evening, Lady Ashworth, and discovered a shared understanding that led quickly to our decision to marry. I understand it may seem unconventional to some, but I assure you, our marriage is entirely genuine." "How very fortunate," Lady Ashworth said, her tone dripping with barely concealed skepticism. "That this shared understanding arrived at precisely the moment his father's will required a wife before midnight. Such convenient timing does invite certain questions, does it not?" Eleanor felt her cheeks warm with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. But before she could formulate a response, Alexander appeared at her side, having clearly overheard the pointed exchange. "Lady Ashworth, I would remind you that questioning the legitimacy of my marriage is questioning my own honor as well as my wife's. I trust you do not intend such an insult within your own hostess's home." Lady Ashworth's expression flickered with something between annoyance and grudging respect at his direct challenge. "Of course not, Your Grace. I meant only to express my curiosity regarding such an unusual romance. Please forgive any perceived offense." As the woman moved away to rejoin another conversation, Eleanor exhaled slowly, grateful for Alexander's timely intervention. "Thank you," she whispered. "I confess I was not entirely certain how to respond to such pointed insinuations." "You need not face these questions alone, Eleanor," Alexander said quietly. "We are partners in this now, whatever the circumstances of our beginning. I will not allow anyone to speak ill of you without consequence." Despite this reassurance, Eleanor could not shake the unsettling feeling that Lady Ashworth's pointed questions were not simply the product of idle curiosity, but rather seeds planted deliberately by someone with a particular interest in discrediting their marriage. Her suspicions were confirmed later that same evening, when she overheard a fragment of conversation near the garden terrace, two gentlemen speaking in hushed but audible tones. "I heard it directly from Ashford himself," one man said quietly. "He claims the woman's family has significant debts, and suspects she may have deliberately positioned herself to be discovered by the Duke that night, knowing full well the deadline he faced." Eleanor froze near the terrace doors, her heart pounding, as she absorbed the implications of what she had just heard. Edmund was not merely making passive inquiries into her background, he was actively spreading fabricated rumors designed to paint her as a calculating opportunist, rather than the reluctant, honest woman she truly was. She found Alexander later that evening, once they had returned to the privacy of their carriage, and relayed what she had overheard with trembling hands. "He is telling people I planned this deliberately, Alexander, that I somehow orchestrated the entire encounter to trap you into marriage." Alexander's expression darkened with obvious anger. "Edmund grows more desperate by the day, it seems. I had hoped he might eventually accept the situation, however unwillingly, but it appears he intends to fight this with every dishonest tactic available to him." "What if people believe him?" Eleanor asked, unable to fully suppress the anxiety creeping into her voice. "What if society decides I truly am some calculating schemer, regardless of the truth?" Alexander reached across the carriage and took her hand gently in his own, a gesture that surprised them both, given the careful boundaries they had maintained since their wedding. "I will not allow such lies to take root unchallenged, Eleanor. We will address this directly, and I will make clear to anyone who questions our marriage that such accusations are entirely baseless." Despite his reassurances, the following weeks brought increasingly difficult challenges, as Edmund's whispered rumors continued spreading through society's tight-knit circles. Eleanor noticed the change gradually at first, then more acutely, as invitations to social gatherings grew scarcer, and the warmth of previous acquaintances cooled into polite but distant civility. Even Grace, the maid who had shown such kindness during Eleanor's first morning at the manor, mentioned overhearing troubling gossip among the staff of neighboring estates. "They are saying terrible things, Your Grace," Grace confided one afternoon, while helping Eleanor prepare for another difficult social engagement. "Some claim you tricked His Grace deliberately. Others suggest your family arranged the entire scheme in advance. I know none of it is true, but I worry how much damage such talk may cause. Thank you for telling me, Grace, Eleanor said, though the weight of such widespread suspicion pressed heavily against her chest. I only wish I knew how to stop such rumors from spreading further. The situation grew more complicated still when Eleanor received an unexpected visit from her Aunt Margaret, who arrived at the manor with an expression of grave concern etched across her weathered features. Eleanor, I felt I must warn you directly. Edmund Ashford visited our home yesterday, asking pointed questions about our family's finances and your father's business dealings before his passing. Eleanor felt a chill settle over her at this news. What did you tell him, Aunt Margaret? I told him nothing beyond what is publicly known, Margaret said firmly. But Eleanor, I fear he intends to twist even the most innocent details of our family's struggles into evidence, supporting his accusations. Your father's business failure, while entirely honest in its circumstances, could easily be portrayed as evidence of desperate financial motives behind your sudden marriage. The revelation left Eleanor feeling increasingly vulnerable, as though every aspect of her past, however innocent, might be weaponized against her by a man determined to reclaim an inheritance he believed rightfully belonged to him. She confided her growing fears to Alexander that evening, watching his expression grow increasingly troubled as she relayed her aunt's warning. This has gone far enough, Alexander said finally, his voice hard with determination. I intend to confront Edmund directly and demand he cease these baseless accusations immediately, or face the legal consequences of slander against both myself and my wife. Do you believe confrontation will resolve this? Eleanor asked, uncertain whether direct action might only escalate an already precarious situation. He seems determined to find some way to undermine our marriage, regardless of what threats we might offer in return. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the same uncertainty that troubled Eleanor. I do not know for certain, Eleanor, but I cannot simply allow him to continue spreading these lies unchallenged. Whatever comes of it, I must at least attempt to address this directly, for both our sakes. The following morning, Alexander departed for Edmund's residence, a modest but well-appointed townhouse located several miles from the Ravenswood estate. Eleanor remained behind, pacing anxiously through the manor's extensive gardens, unable to focus on any of her usual duties, while she awaited news of the confrontation's outcome. Grace found her there hours later, her expression grave. Your Grace, Grace said hesitantly. A messenger has arrived with word from His Grace. He asks that you meet him in the study immediately upon his return, which should be within the hour. Eleanor's stomach twisted with anxiety as she made her way back toward the manor, uncertain what news awaited her, whether Alexander's confrontation with Edmund had succeeded in silencing the damaging rumors, or whether it had instead poured fuel onto an already dangerous fire. She waited in the study, watching the clock tick steadily forward, each passing minute stretching the tension within her chest. When Alexander finally returned, his expression carried an unmistakable weariness that told Eleanor the confrontation had not gone entirely as he had hoped. He entered the study and closed the door behind him, running a tired hand through his hair before speaking. Edmund refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing, he said finally. He claims his questions are merely those of a concerned family member, entitled to understand the circumstances surrounding an inheritance dispute. He denies deliberately spreading false rumors, though I do not believe his denial for even a moment. What did you tell him? Eleanor asked quietly. I warned him plainly that any further slander against you would result in legal action, that I would not hesitate to defend your honor through whatever means necessary. Alexander sighed heavily, sinking into the chair behind his desk. But Eleanor, I fear my warning may have only strengthened his resolve rather than weakening it. He seemed almost pleased by my anger, as though it confirmed something he already suspected. Eleanor felt a growing unease at this news, sensing that their situation had grown more precarious rather than less. What do you believe he intends to do next? Alexander's expression grew grim. I do not know precisely, but I fear he will not simply abandon his efforts to discredit our marriage. He mentioned something before I left, a comment about gathering further evidence that troubled me greatly, though he refused to elaborate further. The uncertainty of Edmund's next move hung over the manor like a storm cloud in the days that followed, and Eleanor found herself increasingly anxious about what fresh accusations or manufactured evidence might yet emerge to threaten the fragile foundation of her new marriage. Despite the genuine warmth that had begun growing between herself and Alexander during their quiet evenings together, She could not shake the feeling that Edmund's determination to reclaim the estate posed a danger far greater than either of them had initially anticipated. Despite the looming threat of Edmund's schemes, life at Ravenswood Manor gradually settled into a rhythm that Eleanor found herself unexpectedly cherishing. The weeks following Alexander's tense confrontation with his cousin brought no immediate fresh scandal, and slowly, cautiously, both Eleanor and Alexander began to relax into the routines of their shared household, even as they remained watchful for any sign of renewed trouble. Eleanor discovered that mornings had become her favorite part of each day, often finding Alexander already awake and walking through the gardens before breakfast, examining the roses his mother had once cultivated with great care before her passing years earlier. She began joining him on these quiet walks, and their conversations, initially stilted and careful, gradually deepened into something far more comfortable and genuine. "My mother loved these gardens more than any other part of the estate," Alexander told her one crisp morning, kneeling beside a bed of deep red roses just beginning to bloom. "She used to say that a garden required patience and honesty, that you could not force a flower to bloom before its time, no matter how much you wished it." "She sounds like she was a wise woman," Eleanor said, watching him carefully tend to the plants, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his usual composed, ducal demeanor. "She was," Alexander agreed, a note of quiet sadness entering his voice. "She passed when I was only 16, and I confess, these gardens are one of the few places I still feel close to her memory. I have not shared that with many people." Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest at this small confidence, recognizing it as another brick laid in the slowly growing foundation of trust between them. "Thank you for sharing that with me, Alexander. I lost my own father only 3 years ago, and I understand something of what it means to find comfort in the small reminders he left behind." "What sort of reminders?" Alexander asked, genuine curiosity in his tone as he rose from his kneeling position beside the roses. "He loved to read aloud to my mother and me each evening," Eleanor said, smiling faintly at the memory. "Even after his business began to fail, even when we worried constantly about our finances, he never once skipped an evening of reading together as a family. I still keep his favorite book on my nightstand, though I rarely have the courage to open it these days." Alexander studied her with an expression of genuine warmth. "Perhaps you might read to me sometime, Eleanor. I confess I have not had anyone read aloud to me since my own mother passed, and I find myself curious what stories captured your father's heart so completely." The suggestion, simple as it was, filled Eleanor with an unexpected happiness that surprised her with its intensity. "I would like that very much, Alexander." That evening, after a quiet dinner shared without the pressure of social obligations or watchful society eyes, Eleanor retrieved her father's worn copy of an old adventure novel and settled into the library beside Alexander, reading aloud by the warm glow of the fireplace. Alexander listened intently, occasionally asking questions about the story or offering his own thoughts on the characters, and Eleanor found herself laughing genuinely for the first time in what felt like ages, the weight of Edmund's looming threats momentarily forgotten in the comfort of shared storytelling. As the weeks continued, such quiet evenings became a cherished ritual between them, a private world they built together, away from the scrutiny of society and the constant shadow of Edmund's schemes. Eleanor began to notice small changes in herself as well, a growing confidence in her role as Duchess, a genuine affection for the tenants and staff she had come to know through her regular visits and conversations, and an unexpected fondness for the man she had married under such desperate circumstances. One particularly memorable afternoon, a sudden rainstorm caught both Eleanor and Alexander far from the manor, while inspecting repairs needed at one of the tenant cottages. Rather than waiting out the storm in discomfort, they found themselves laughing together as they dashed through the downpour toward a nearby barn, arriving soaked but breathless, with genuine amusement rather than frustration. "I believe this qualifies as one of the least dignified moments in Ravenswood family history," Alexander said, wringing water from his sleeve while Eleanor attempted to smooth her thoroughly drenched hair. "I rather think your ancestors would forgive us, given the circumstances," Eleanor replied, unable to suppress her laughter at the absurdity of their situation, both of them dripping wet inside a modest barn, while thunder rumbled overhead. As they waited for the storm to pass, sitting together on a bale of hay while rain drummed steadily against the roof above them, Alexander turned to her with an expression more serious than the playful mood of moments before. "Eleanor, I want you to know that these past weeks, despite everything with Edmund, have brought me more genuine happiness than I believed possible when I first proposed such a desperate arrangement behind that curtain. Eleanor felt her heart skip at his words, recognizing the vulnerability behind his usually composed exterior. I feel the same, Alexander. I came into this marriage expecting nothing more than practical security, and instead, I have found something I never dared hope for. And what is that? Alexander asked quietly, his gaze steady and searching. Genuine friendship, Eleanor said softly, though even as she spoke the words, she recognized that what had grown between them felt like something deeper still, something she was not yet entirely ready to name aloud. A partner who listens to my thoughts and treats my opinions with respect, rather than simply seeing me as an obligation to be managed. Alexander reached over and gently took her hand, his thumb tracing softly across her knuckles, in a gesture that sent warmth spreading through her entire body. You are far more than an obligation to me, Eleanor. I confess I find myself looking forward to our mornings in the garden and our evenings by the fire more than I ever imagined I would, given how our marriage began. The rain continued falling steadily outside, but within the modest shelter of that barn, Eleanor felt something shift irrevocably between them, an acknowledgement of feelings neither of them had expected to develop from such a hasty, practical arrangement. Neither spoke further of it that afternoon, content instead to simply sit together in comfortable silence until the storm finally passed. But the quiet understanding between them lingered long after they returned to the manor, both soaked but strangely lighter than before. In the days that followed, Eleanor noticed small but significant changes in how Alexander treated her, a warmth in his gaze that lingered slightly longer than necessary, a tendency to seek out her opinion on matters of estate management even when her input was not strictly required. Small gestures of consideration that spoke of genuine care rather than mere obligation. She found herself reciprocating these gestures naturally, seeking his company during quiet moments throughout the day, sharing small observations and thoughts that she would once have kept private. Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed among the household staff either. Grace mentioned it one afternoon while helping Eleanor prepare for a quiet dinner with several of the estate's tenant families. If I may say so, Your Grace, you and His Grace seem far happier these days than when you first arrived. Mrs. Whitmore says she has not seen him smile so often in all the years she has served this household. Thank you, Grace, Eleanor said, feeling a warm blush rise to her cheeks. I confess I feel rather happier myself these days, despite everything that troubles us still with his cousin. Despite the genuine happiness growing between them, Eleanor could not entirely shake the persistent worry that Edmund remained a threat, lurking somewhere in the shadows of their new contentment. She mentioned this concern to Alexander one evening, as they sat together in the library, the comfortable silence between them interrupted by her growing unease. Do you believe he has truly given up his schemes? She asked, watching the fire crackle softly before them. It has been weeks now since his last direct confrontation with you, and yet I cannot help but feel his silence is more troubling than reassuring. Alexander's expression grew thoughtful, the contentment of their quiet evening momentarily clouded by the return of a concern he had clearly been trying to set aside as well. I confess, I share your unease, Eleanor. Edmund is not a man to simply abandon his ambitions without cause. His silence likely means he is gathering whatever resources or evidence he believes will strengthen his position before making his next move. What sort of evidence could he possibly gather that would change anything? Eleanor asked, though even as she spoke, an uncomfortable thought occurred to her, a memory of certain private family matters she had never fully shared with Alexander, details she had considered too painful and too irrelevant to discuss even amid their growing intimacy. Alexander noticed her sudden hesitation and studied her carefully. Eleanor, is there something troubling you specifically? You seem to have thought of something just now. Eleanor hesitated, wondering whether to share the private worry that had suddenly surfaced in her mind, a detail from her family's past that Edmund might potentially discover and twist into damaging accusations against her character. There is something from my past, Alexander, something I have not yet shared with you, though I do not believe it reflects poorly on my character. I simply never found the right moment to discuss it. You may tell me anything, Eleanor, Alexander said gently, his expression open and without judgment. Whatever it may be, I trust you completely, and I would rather hear difficult truths from you directly than discover them through Edmund's manipulations. Eleanor took a steadying breath, gathering her courage to share a piece of her past she had kept private since their wedding, uncertain how Alexander might react to the revelation she was about to make, and equally uncertain whether this private confession might inadvertently provide Edmund with exactly the weapon he had been searching for all along. My father, before his passing, borrowed a modest sum from a merchant named Mr. Alcott. Eleanor began carefully, watching Alexander's face for any sign of judgment as she spoke. It was a debt incurred during the final difficult months of his failing business, and though we eventually repaid a portion of it, a small amount technically remains outstanding to this day. I mention this only because I recently learned, through my aunt, that Mr. Alcott is a distant acquaintance of your cousin Edmund. Alexander's expression remained calm and attentive, though a slight furrow appeared between his brows. I see. And do you believe this debt might somehow be twisted into evidence against you? I fear it might, Eleanor admitted. Though the debt itself is innocent enough, a common circumstance for many families who have faced financial hardship, I worry that Edmund could present it as evidence that my family was desperate enough for money to have deliberately orchestrated our meeting that night, hoping to secure a wealthy match regardless of the truth of how we actually met. Alexander reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his own. Eleanor, a small remaining debt from your father's failed business proves nothing beyond the simple fact that your family, like countless others, faced difficult circumstances beyond your control. I do not believe this detail alone gives Edmund any true power over us. Eleanor felt some of her anxiety ease at his steady reassurance, though a lingering unease remained at the back of her mind. She had shared her secret honestly, just as she had promised during their wedding negotiations, and Alexander's response had been exactly the understanding and support she had hoped for. Still, she could not entirely shake the sense that Edmund, given his evident determination, might find some way to twist even the most innocent truth into something far more damaging. Her fears proved well-founded barely a week later, when Simon arrived at breakfast with an expression of grave concern, carrying a folded newspaper that he set carefully before Alexander. Your Grace, I believe you should see this immediately. It appears in this morning's society pages. Alexander unfolded the paper and scanned the contents, his face growing increasingly pale as he read. Eleanor watched with mounting dread, her stomach twisting into knots as she waited to learn what fresh scandal had emerged to threaten their fragile happiness. What is it? She asked finally, unable to bear the suspense any longer. Alexander set the paper down slowly, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. There is a letter reproduced here, Eleanor, supposedly written by you to a friend several weeks before our wedding. It describes, in your own apparent handwriting, a deliberate scheme to position yourself at my ball, aware in advance of the deadline in my father's will, with the express intention of securing a marriage proposal through calculated manipulation. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face entirely. That is impossible, Alexander. I wrote no such letter. I did not even know of your father's will, or its deadline, until you told me yourself, behind that very curtain, mere minutes before you proposed. I believe you completely, Alexander said firmly, though his expression remained troubled. But this letter, forged or not, has already been printed for all of society to read. Whoever crafted this deception clearly intended maximum damage to our reputation, and I fear Edmund's fingerprints are all over this scheme, even if his name appears nowhere in the article itself. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read through the printed excerpt herself, recognizing immediately that while the handwriting bore some superficial resemblance to her own, certain phrases and turns of expression felt entirely foreign to how she actually wrote or spoke. This is not my hand, Alexander, not truly. Whoever forged this letter did so skillfully, but there are details here that any person who truly knew me would recognize as false. Then we must prove it, Alexander said, determination replacing the shock in his expression. We shall consult a Lang expert in handwriting analysis immediately, and we shall demand to know the source of this supposed letter, tracing its origin back to whoever fabricated such a cruel deception. Despite Alexander's resolve, the damage among society had already begun to spread rapidly. Invitations that had grown scarce in previous weeks now ceased almost entirely, and Eleanor felt the weight of countless disapproving stares whenever she ventured beyond the manor's protective walls. Even Grace reported increasingly hostile whispers among the staff of neighboring estates, rumors that painted Eleanor as a calculating fortune hunter, rather than the honest, reluctant bride she truly was. The situation grew even more painful when Eleanor received an unexpected and deeply hurtful letter from her own aunt, expressing confusion and concern about the scandal now consuming society's attention. Margaret's words, though clearly written out of worry rather than malice, still cut deeply into Eleanor's already fragile confidence. "Eleanor, I do not know what to believe any longer," the letter read in part. "I have always trusted your honesty, yet this letter printed in the papers seems so detailed, so specific in its knowledge of our family's circumstances, that I confess uncertainty has crept into my heart, despite my deepest wish to believe in your innocence." Reading her aunt's words, Eleanor felt something within her begin to crumble, the accumulated weight of weeks of suspicion and gossip finally breaking through her careful composure. She found herself alone in her private chambers that evening, tears falling freely as she considered the possibility that even those closest to her might come to doubt her honesty and integrity. Alexander found her there later that night, her eyes red from crying, and his expression softened with genuine concern as he sat beside her. "Eleanor, what has happened? You seem far more distressed than even this current scandal alone would explain." "My own aunt doubts me now, Alexander," Eleanor said, her voice breaking slightly with the pain of the admission. "The one person who has always trusted me completely now questions whether I truly deceived you, as this forged letter suggests. If she can doubt me, despite knowing my character for my entire life, how can I possibly hope that the rest of society will ever believe otherwise?" Alexander pulled her gently into his arms, and Eleanor allowed herself the comfort of his embrace, grateful for a moment of genuine solace amid the storm of accusations surrounding them. "I believe you completely, Eleanor, and I will not allow anyone, including your own aunt, to convince me otherwise. We shall find proof of this forgery, and we shall clear your name entirely, whatever effort it requires." Despite his reassurances, Eleanor could not fully banish the fear taking root within her heart, a growing suspicion that perhaps this marriage, born of such desperate and unusual circumstances, might ultimately prove too fragile to withstand the relentless assault of Edmund's calculated schemes. She began to wonder, in her darkest moments, whether she should simply withdraw from the marriage entirely, sparing Alexander further scandal and protecting her own wounded heart from further pain. This uncertainty grew stronger the following day, when Edmund himself appeared unexpectedly at the manor, requesting a private audience with Alexander that Eleanor was pointedly excluded from. She waited anxiously in the hallway outside the study, straining to catch fragments of the heated conversation taking place behind the closed door, though the thick wood muffled most of the actual words being exchanged. When Alexander finally emerged from the study nearly an hour later, his expression carried a complicated mixture of anger and troubled uncertainty that immediately alarmed Eleanor. "What did he say?" she asked, following him as he walked briskly toward his private study. "He claims to possess additional evidence," Alexander said grimly. "Documents supposedly proving that you and your aunt conspired together to secure this marriage through deliberate deception. He offered to withhold this evidence from public scrutiny if I agreed to voluntarily annul our marriage and relinquish the estate to his control." Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her feet at this revelation. "And what did you tell him?" Alexander's jaw tightened with visible restraint. "I refused, of course, though I confess the confrontation has left me deeply troubled. Eleanor, I do not doubt your honesty, but I fear Edmund's determination to destroy this marriage has grown far more dangerous than either of us anticipated. Whatever evidence he claims to possess, real or fabricated, he clearly intends to use it without mercy." That night, alone in her chambers once more, Eleanor found herself wrestling with an impossible decision, torn between her growing love for Alexander and her fear that remaining in this marriage might only bring him further scandal and hardship. As dawn approached, exhausted from a sleepless night of anxious deliberation, she made a decision that felt simultaneously like the bravest and most painful choice of her entire life. By the time the first light of morning touched the horizon, Eleanor had packed a small bag with only the essential belongings she had brought with her when she first arrived at Ravenswood Manor as a bride. She stood at the window of her chamber, watching the sun rise over the gardens Alexander's mother had once tended so carefully, and felt her heart breaking at the thought of leaving behind the genuine happiness she had found within these walls. She believed, in her exhausted and anxious state, that her departure would spare Alexander further scandal, that removing herself from the equation entirely might allow him to negotiate some resolution with Edmund that protected the estate without the continued burden of a marriage under such intense public scrutiny. It was, she told herself, the only truly selfless choice remaining to her, even as every fiber of her being resisted the idea of walking away from the man she had come to love so unexpectedly. She had just gathered her small bag and moved toward the door when it opened suddenly, revealing Alexander standing in the hallway, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and alarm as he took in the sight of her prepared for departure. "Eleanor, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "I am leaving, Alexander," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the tears threatening to spill over. "I believe it is the only way to protect you from further scandal. If I disappear quietly, perhaps Edmund's accusations will lose their power, and you can find some peaceful resolution to this entire situation without my presence complicating matters further." Alexander stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him with a firmness that left no doubt about his determination to prevent her departure. "I will not allow you to sacrifice yourself for my sake, Eleanor. Not now, not ever. Whatever Edmund threatens, whatever scandal he manufactures, I would rather face it together with you than achieve peace through your absence." "But Alexander," Eleanor protested, her composure finally breaking as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. "Your aunt herself expressed doubt. Society has turned against us both, and Edmund seems determined to destroy everything, regardless of the truth. I cannot bear to be the cause of your continued suffering." Alexander crossed the room quickly and took her hands in his own, his eyes fierce with an emotion Eleanor had not seen from him before. "Listen to me carefully, Eleanor. I spent last night, after Edmund's visit, investigating his supposed evidence rather than sleeping. I discovered something that changes everything." Eleanor's tears paused momentarily, curiosity breaking through her despair. "What did you discover?" "The forged letter published in the papers," Alexander said, his voice growing steadier with each word, "was written by a woman named Beatrice Colton, a former servant dismissed from your aunt's household several months ago, under circumstances of theft. Edmund apparently sought her out and paid her handsomely to forge a letter in your handwriting, having learned of her resentment toward your family following her dismissal." Eleanor's mouth fell open in shock. "How did you discover this?" "Simon has connections throughout the county's household staff," Alexander explained. "He made inquiries on my behalf yesterday evening, and this morning, one of Beatrice's former associates came forward, having grown uneasy about the entire scheme, once she realized how far Edmund intended to take his deception. She confirmed everything, Eleanor, and she has agreed to testify to the truth before witnesses, including Mr. Whitcomb himself." Relief and vindication flooded through Eleanor so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled beneath her. "Then this proves everything, Alexander. This proves I never wrote that letter, that Edmund fabricated the entire scandal from nothing but malice and desperation." "It proves precisely that," Alexander confirmed, his expression softening as he reached up to gently wipe away the remaining tears from her cheeks. "And it proves something else as well, Eleanor. It proves that whatever accusations Edmund throws against us, whatever schemes he devises, the truth will always emerge eventually, provided we remain steadfast and honest with each other throughout every trial." Eleanor felt the weight of the past week's anxiety finally beginning to lift, replaced by a growing sense of hope she had not allowed herself to fully feel since Edmund's scheme had first begun. "What happens now?" "Now," Alexander said, a fierce determination returning to his voice, "we confront Edmund publicly, with Beatrice's associate as our witness, and we expose this entire fabrication before society itself. I will not allow him to escape the consequences of such a cruel and calculated deception against my wife's honor." Later that same day, Alexander arranged a gathering at the manor, inviting several prominent members of society, including Lady Ashworth and Lady Pemberton, along with Mr. Whitcomb and, most importantly, Edmund himself, under the pretense of discussing a supposed resolution to their ongoing family dispute. Eleanor stood beside Alexander as the guests assembled in the manor's grand drawing room, her heart pounding with a mixture of nervousness and determined resolve. Edmund arrived looking confident, clearly believing he held the advantage in whatever negotiation Alexander intended to propose. His expression shifted to confusion, however, when he noticed the presence of a young woman he clearly did not expect, standing quietly near the drawing room entrance alongside Simon. "Cousin," Edmund said smoothly, addressing Alexander with false cordiality, I confess I am uncertain what this gathering is meant to accomplish, given our previous conversation's clear terms. Edmund, Alexander said, his voice carrying easily throughout the assembled room. I have gathered everyone here today, because I believe it is time the truth behind recent events comes fully to light. You have accused my wife of forging deliberate schemes to secure our marriage, presenting a fabricated letter as evidence of her supposed deception. Edmund's expression flickered with the first hint of unease. The letter's authenticity was never disputed by any credible authority, Alexander. I merely presented evidence that came into my possession. Evidence you paid to have created, Alexander said firmly, gesturing toward the young woman standing near Simon. This is Miss Hannah Fletcher, a former associate of Beatrice Colton, the woman you commissioned to forge that letter in my wife's handwriting. Miss Fletcher has agreed to testify to the truth of this arrangement before all present today. A murmur of shock rippled through the assembled guests as Hannah stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly but clear as she recounted the details of Edmund's scheme, describing how he had sought out Beatrice, specifically because of her resentment toward Eleanor's family, offering substantial payment in exchange for the fabricated letter designed to destroy Eleanor's reputation and force an end to the marriage. Edmund's face had grown pale as Hannah spoke, his earlier confidence crumbling entirely beneath the weight of such damning testimony. This is preposterous, he sputtered, though the conviction had entirely drained from his voice. This woman clearly lies, perhaps paid by my own cousin to fabricate this counter-accusation. I have no reason to lie, Mr. Ashford, Hannah said steadily, meeting his furious gaze without flinching. I came forward because my conscience would not allow me to remain silent, while an innocent woman's reputation was destroyed through such calculated cruelty. Lady Ashworth, who had been among the loudest voices spreading suspicion about Eleanor in recent weeks, stepped forward with an expression of genuine shock. Mr. Ashworth, if this testimony proves accurate, you have engaged in a truly despicable deception, one that has caused significant harm to an innocent woman's reputation and standing in society. I demand proof beyond mere words, Edmund said, though his voice carried far less conviction than before. Mr. Whitcomb stepped forward then, holding several documents he had apparently prepared in advance. I have taken the liberty of consulting with a respected handwriting expert, Mr. Ashford, comparing the forged letter against genuine samples of the Duchess's actual handwriting, provided by her aunt. The expert's written assessment confirms significant discrepancies that clearly indicate forgery, discrepancies consistent with exactly the kind of deception Miss Fletcher has described. The room fell into stunned silence as the full weight of the evidence settled over the assembled guests. Edmund looked around at the faces surrounding him, finding no sympathy or support among people who had, until mere moments ago, largely accepted his fabricated accusations without question. Finally, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I only wished for what was rightfully mine, he said quietly, though the words carried little conviction now. This estate should have passed to me, had my cousin simply failed to secure a marriage in time. I merely sought to correct what I believed was an unjust outcome. You sought to destroy an innocent woman's reputation through deliberate lies and manipulation, Alexander said firmly, though something almost like pity entered his voice as he studied his cousin's defeated posture. Whatever grievances you harbor regarding the will's terms, Edmund, nothing justifies the cruelty you have inflicted upon my wife these past weeks. Lady Pemberton, who had remained largely silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up with quiet authority. Mr. Ashford, given the evidence presented today, I believe society will rightly judge your actions with the harshest disapproval. I suggest you consider carefully whether you wish to remain within these social circles at all, given what has now come to light. Edmund said nothing further, simply turning and walking from the room with as much dignity as he could manage under the circumstances, though the whispers that followed him made clear that his standing among society had been irreparably damaged by his own scheming ambition. As the gathered guests began offering their own apologies and expressions of support to Eleanor, she felt an overwhelming wave of relief wash over her, the weeks of accumulated fear and suspicion finally beginning to dissolve into genuine vindication. Lady Ashworth, in particular, approached her with an expression of genuine contrition. Duchess, I owe you a sincere apology for my part in spreading doubt about your character these past weeks, she said. I allowed myself to be swayed by rumors without properly questioning their source. and I deeply regret the pain this must have caused you." "Thank you, Lady Ashworth," Eleanor said graciously, though relief made her voice slightly unsteady. "I appreciate your willingness to acknowledge the truth now that it has come to light." Once the guests had departed, and the manor grew quiet once more, Alexander found Eleanor standing near the very same library window where they had first shared their quiet evening reading together weeks earlier. He approached slowly, studying her expression carefully. "You were prepared to leave me this morning," he said softly, "believing your absence would somehow spare me further pain." "I was," Eleanor admitted, turning to face him fully. "I feared that remaining married to me would bring you nothing but continued scandal and hardship, regardless of the truth behind Edmund's accusations." Alexander stepped closer, taking her hands gently in his own once more. "Eleanor, what began between us as a desperate arrangement of practical necessity has become, for me, something far more precious than I ever expected to find. I do not simply tolerate this marriage for the sake of the estate any longer. I love you, Eleanor, entirely and completely, and I do not wish to imagine my life without you beside me." Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes once more, though this time they were tears of overwhelming joy rather than sorrow. "I love you as well, Alexander. What I felt this morning was not doubt in our marriage, but fear that my presence alone might cause you harm. Now that the truth has finally emerged, I find myself wishing for nothing more than to remain by your side, not out of obligation, but out of genuine love and choice." "Then choose me, Eleanor," Alexander said softly, not as the desperate bride hidden behind a curtain, forced by circumstance into an impossible bargain, but as my true wife, chosen freely and completely. "I choose you," Eleanor said, her voice steady and certain despite the tears still glistening in her eyes. "Now and always, Alexander, I choose this marriage, and I choose you." As Alexander drew her into a gentle embrace, Eleanor felt the last remnants of fear and uncertainty finally dissolve entirely, replaced by a deep and abiding contentment she had never expected to find when she first hid behind those ballroom curtains, desperate only to escape notice on a night that had, against all odds, changed the entire course of her life for the better. Autumn arrived at Ravenswood Manor, bringing with it a season of quiet renewal, the gardens shifting into rich shades of amber and gold, as Eleanor and Alexander settled into a marriage now built on genuine love rather than mere necessity. News of Edmund's disgrace spread quickly through society, and within a month, he had quietly departed for a distant relative's estate in the north, evidently deciding that rebuilding his reputation would prove far easier away from the county where his scheme had been so thoroughly exposed. Neither Eleanor nor Alexander heard from him again, though occasional rumors suggested he had taken up a far more modest life, having squandered much of his own inheritance on the very schemes meant to steal theirs. With Edmund's threat finally removed, Eleanor found herself embracing her role as Duchess with a confidence that grew steadily each passing week. She organized an autumn harvest festival for the estate's tenants, the first such gathering in many years, bringing together farmers, servants, and nobility alike, in a celebration that Alexander later admitted reminded him fondly of similar gatherings his mother had once hosted before her passing. The festival proved such a success that several prominent families, including Lady Pemberton herself, requested invitations for the following year, marking a clear turning point in society's acceptance of Eleanor as a woman of genuine character, rather than the calculating schemer Edmund had once painted her to be. Margaret visited frequently during these months, her earlier doubts entirely replaced by evident pride in her niece's transformation, from an overlooked young woman hiding behind curtains into a duchess respected throughout the county for her kindness and good sense. During one such visit, as the two women walked together through the gardens Alexander's mother had once tended, Margaret finally voiced the apology that had weighed on her conscience since the scandal's resolution. "I should never have doubted you, Eleanor," she said softly, "even for a moment, even amid such convincing lies. I am deeply sorry for the pain my uncertainty must have added to an already difficult time." "You need not apologize further, Aunt Margaret," Eleanor said, embracing her warmly. "The lies Edmund constructed were designed precisely to create such doubt, even among those who loved me most. I understand entirely, and I am simply grateful that the truth emerged before any lasting damage could be done to our family's bond." As winter approached, Eleanor and Alexander's marriage continued deepening, in ways neither had anticipated, when they first stood together before Father Collins, on that desperate midnight so many months earlier. Their quiet evenings reading together in the library became a cherished nightly ritual, and their morning walks through the gardens expanded to include longer conversations about the future they hoped to build together, from improvements they wished to make for the estate's tenants, to quiet dreams of expanding their own family in the years ahead. One particularly cold evening in early December, as snow began falling softly outside the library windows, Eleanor shared news with Alexander that filled his eyes with a joy she had never before witnessed in him, not even during the relief of their marriage's vindication months earlier. She was carrying their first child, a discovery that transformed their already happy marriage into something even more profound, a partnership now looking toward a future that would extend the Ravenswood legacy through choice and love rather than the desperate necessity that had once bound them together. "I never imagined, that night behind the curtain," Alexander said, holding Eleanor close as they watched the snow fall together, "that such an impossible, desperate bargain could lead to a happiness this complete. You saved far more than this estate, Eleanor. You saved me from a lonely, hollow life I had resigned myself to accepting. And you gave me a life I never dared hope for," Eleanor replied, resting her head against his shoulder as the fire crackled warmly beside them. "A home, a partner who respects and cherishes me, and now a family of our own to look forward to. Whatever challenges brought us together, Alexander, I would not trade this life for any other." As the new year approached, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings and the anticipation of their growing family, Eleanor often found herself reflecting on that fateful night when fear and desperation had driven a duke to make an impossible request of a stranger hiding behind velvet curtains. What had begun as a practical arrangement born of necessity had transformed, through honesty, courage, and genuine care, into a love story neither of them could have predicted, proving that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most enduring and precious endings of all. Ravenswood Manor, once a house burdened by the weight of a cruel deadline and a desperate bargain, had become instead a true home, filled with warmth, laughter, and the quiet certainty of a love that had grown strong enough to weather scandal, deception, and doubt, emerging on the other side, more resilient and genuine than either Eleanor or Alexander could have imagined possible on that strange and fateful midnight when everything between them had first begun.